Hi, my name is Ensong Philip Cho. I'm a writer and mental health advocate, and I'm in the street.
Suicide affects us all, but it's especially troublesome in one South American country. I'm Femi Oke.
And I'm Malika Bilal. Today, a look at the high suicide rate in Guyana and how the country is addressing the epidemic.
It's not the notoriety that any country wants, but between Guyana's dense rainforest and luscious coast lies a sad truth. The country has the highest suicide rate in the world. According to the World Health Organization, 44 out of every 100,000 Guyanese take their own lives, and that's more than double the global average of 16 in 100,000 people.
So why are so many living without hope? Joining us to discuss that in Georgetown, Guyana, Caitlin Vieira. She's a psychologist specializing in addiction and suicidal behavior at Georgetown Public Hospital. Also in Guyana, Jerwayne Wills. He's a journalist who's written about this issue. In the Grand Cayman, Supriya Singh, founder of Guyana Foundation. And in Toronto, Canada, Savitri Persad. She's a PhD candidate whose research analyzes Caribbean narratives and interpretations of mental health, disablement, and violence. Welcome to the stream, everyone. We also invited several members from the Ministry of Health to join this conversation, but they're all at a retreat trying to tackle this very issue. So very timely. So let's start with our community. Now, many people online share their ideas for why suicide is such a big issue in the country. Here's what a few of them told us.
The stigma surrounding mental illness in Guyana is so deeply integrated into the culture that it negatively affects the perception of those suffering from symptoms of mental illness, as well as those suffering from suicidal thoughts.
A lot of the problems we observe is stemmed from the high unemployment and lack of effective resources available.
Me being in Guyana right now and having family that are Guyanese have experienced a lot of stories about people committing suicide due to the simple fact that they feel like no one cares about them. They may feel like they can't afford to live in this country because it's so hard to get jobs. They feel like no one wants to listen.
So Caitlin, we heard living with economic stress, we heard stigma, feeling like no one cares. You're the coordinator for the suicide hotline. What is it that people tell you when they call?
I see a lot of alcohol and drug abuse, but they're right, I see a lot of economic deprivation, a lot of physical abuse, domestic violence, of course, insufficient coping mechanisms, low education, a lot. Pretty much everything across the scale.
See, Supriya, people will be watching this and be thinking, what's different about Guyana that it should have almost double the global rate of suicides? This is something that you understand, that you've worked on the ground and you appreciate. If you could explain that to an international audience, is it something about Guyana in particular?
I'll say this to you, and I think I'm very happy you phrased the question the way you did, because I think you might arrive at a better answer. And that is that you must take into consideration that Guyana is a country that has come through a period of slavery, indentureship, turbulent politics from pre-independence, post-independence, and politics that has been racially divisive. And so the people of Guyana have had a lot on their plate to deal with, compounded by the fact that economically they have not been doing well. Our poverty indexes are very high, and generally speaking, people are feeling the pinch. We have recently changed governments and trying to make our way forward, but the pressures that the people of Guyana have been under have been tremendous. And so it is no wonder then that the fabric of the society is so weak. And I have spent much time trying to understand from professionals, and I say this, I'm not a mental health professional in any way, but I have tried to engage those professionals to explain this problem to me. And while some give me answers in some areas, I think we must look at it as a whole. And so I don't think that the Guyanese people have this propensity towards suicide. I believe it's a series of factors that has led up to a population that is in this fragile condition.
Savitri, do you feel that there's one part of the population that is more likely to have suicidal thoughts than another part of the population in Guyana?
No, not at all. And I think, and Supriya briefly mentioned this about, the racial divisions in the country. But I think that it would be misguided to say that, any one demographic or set of folks are experiencing higher rates of suicide than others, or to boil it down to a racial determinants argument. I agree with much of what has been said by others, in that there is no one cause, but that suicide
Absolutely.
is a symptom of much larger social, economic, and political problems that we're dealing with in the country. And some of those things can range from, other problems that were mentioned by Caitlin, which include, violence against women, drug and substance abuse issues, economic disenfranchisement. We have several, compounding issues that we have to deal with as a nation, and I think that this is just one symptom of these problems.
See, Savitri, there are.
I just want to interrupt for a second.
Yeah, Caitlin, go ahead.
I completely agree with what Savitri said. It's a much larger picture, but Indo-Guyanese are responsible for 80% of the suicides in Guyana. So, and the helplines
I
are not.
understand that, but I think that we shouldn't necessarily boil that down to a racial determinants argument. We should definitely look at the context in terms of what's happening in those communities. And in large part, Indo-Guyanese tend to live in rural village communities. So we need to really have a grasp of what's happening in those communities. And yes, you're absolutely right that suicides do affect Indo-Guyanese more. But to make a racial determinants argument, or to say that it's Indians,
I tend to agree with you, Savitri.
That we need to kind of, be very careful in forging those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Savitri there, that some of the commentary that has come out of this is that people tend to attribute it to one particular racial group, which is the Indian population. But I think that's erroneous. I think we should look at it in a much wider scale, because yes, there are reasons why suicides are happening more in that particular ethnic group, but it has to do with their cultural, the way they live their lives. They're more introverted, they stay to themselves, they perhaps don't have the kind of coping skills and interactions with others as freely as other ethnicities do. But across the board, I have come across, as I'm sure you have, Caitlin, suicides from all races in Guyana.
I want to bring up a question from our community here, from someone outside of Guyana. And Darwin, I'll give you this tweet, and it's likely what several people are thinking. This is Brian. He says, "Are officials in Guyana curious why people are committing suicide all of a sudden, if that is indeed the case, that it's all of a sudden, and how long has it been? Can you give us some context for this issue? Because I know it's something you've been covering."
Yeah, I mean, suicide has always been a concern for us. I mean, the figures didn't just show up after 2015. Although when we entered 2016, there was an alarming increase in the amount of suicides happening. Some of those had to do with the hopelessness that some people felt. And it just goes to the core, which is the politicization of a lot of the issues within this country. I mean, a lot of people were feeling hopeless after the change of government because of how the polarization is set up. So there is a zero-sum competition happening right now between the two dominant races within the country, Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. And so when the power shifted, and some people felt as though the power shifted from sort of Indo-Guyanese to Afro-Guyanese, and this whole conversation about is we time, you notice that there were a lot of people who started squatting on state lands because they felt as though the provisions that were being made for them under the previous administration would no longer be made for them under this current administration. So what people did even was that outside of the squatting and outside of the what is this I'm trying to say? Let's just say that the concern for the politicians coming into 2016 was that there was an increase, and the increase had to do with the hopelessness of the people who would have committed suicide and the lack of coping mechanisms that they would have had to deal with those issues, especially from their political leaders who were supposed to be giving leadership, but instead were sort of encouraging this sort of thing to happen.
Let me just ask you this, because I know you're very familiar with this topic and you've seen a lot of different cases. As we're talking, will you share some of those cases with us so we actually understand the situation of the various different members of the community that they're going through? Supriya, you said that you can give us some insight into what's happening right now. What's the story that sticks in your mind?
In my efforts through the foundation to deal with this suicide crisis, our foundation started basically looking at poverty reduction, bringing down, doing village renewal and so on. But that's where I was about to disagree with my colleague here, because those problems to do with suicide did not surface in 2016. They have been on the ground, and I have personally experienced that, and that has been going on a long time ago.
So, Supriya, what I was saying is, can you give us examples? Because this is an extreme case. This is the highest suicide rate in the world. Can you tell us the sort of experiences that you're trying to stop?
We've got, look, simple cases where you're losing life senselessly. Recently, the one that touched my heart tremendously was the story of a mother and a daughter, where a sum of money was owed, and the daughter pawned the jewels or something to do with the mother, and the mother ingested poison and killed herself. The daughter took the time to call her brother to say, our mother's dead. She ingested poison. And by the time the brother got there, the daughter had ingested the poison as well. So you lost 2 lives there. You have stories like that. You have stories like a young 13-year-old boy of mixed race in a dormitory in Essequibo, who's left in a dormitory. His mother and father split up. His mother doesn't visit him at all. She, probably financially desperate, he tries to steal a piece of watermelon, try to get money and steal money to buy something in a canteen. He's bullied by children. They find him hanging in a washroom, and he's 13 years old. And the stories get more and more disturbing as you go. We can spend the whole hour of the show talking about the incidence of suicide. I sent a group of people to a village. Yeah.
I definitely agree with Supriya, in terms of looking at these different aspects and different dynamics and trying to tell or give a clearer and a more contextualized picture. And I think one of that, one main issue that we also need to address in Guyana is the issue of domestic violence and violence against women and violence against children. And oftentimes when you read in the newspapers, and we come across this all the time, incidences of murder-suicide, whereby a man has abused and oftentimes murdered his wife and then goes on to take his life. Yes, we have this, we have this number then accorded to, the suicide stats of this man taking his life. But what gets lost in that statistic, and what gets lost there, is the fact that a woman has been murdered, right? So we have to also think about who is getting counted, and what this figure of 44.2 out of 100,000 actually doesn't reveal to us. One of the more salient stories that came out of the work that I've done with women's organizations, particularly Red Thread, was a case of a young mother who was in a situation of domestic violence. She felt so hopeless, wasn't receiving any help, wasn't receiving any assistance from the police. She had 2 children, and so for her, the only options that were made available was to take her own life, or that's what she felt at that point in time. And so she consumed the poisonous substance.
That's not an option. I mean, that isn't an option.
Of course it's not an option, but this is what this woman felt, right?
That
is desperation.
Let me just check in with Malika. Malika.
Oh, well, Savitri, you mentioned gender-based violence and domestic violence being something that needs to be looked at when we talk about suicides. There's actually someone who says just that. This is Solis Hooper. She sent us a video comment. She actually works on gender-based violence cases and explains how that links then to suicide prevention and what she does in villages in Guyana. Have a listen.
I am Solis Hooper, Prevention Officer and Counselor at Roadside Baptist Skills Training Center at number 68 Village on the Quarantine of Berbice, Guyana, South America. I dare say Guyana is renowned for its high suicidal rate. In October of this year, a special training program on suicide awareness was held. Of the 26 persons trained, a few attempted suicides, and many had suicidal thoughts at some point in time in their lives.
So Caitlin, she mentions that even those who were doing the training had firsthand experience with this. Is that something that you run into when you're working with those who are behind the scenes of the hotline operation? Is that something that you see as well?
Yeah, well, with the women who answer the calls, I ensure that I do group therapy with them almost weekly. Obviously that goes by, but it helps them as everybody suffering. But I would like to share a story, a really quick story of someone who called in the helpline. It speaks to every issue that's in Guyana. There was a girl who called. She was 14. She just had a baby for her father, who sexually abused her. He was addicted to alcohol. So that speaks, one, to the abuse, and two, to the problems with alcohol. And basically, her mother couldn't read or write, and they had 5 other children. So the mother didn't want to report the father to police, because how else is she going to support her children? So we had to figure out a way to get everybody out of that situation without making them starve, as Guyana doesn't really have great public assistance. So we had to go through the courts. One second, please. We had to go through the courts and we filed restraining orders and maintenance orders. So he's still on the street, but he's working to support the family. He had to move out to the house. But that just speaks to the kind of issues that I see every day. But that's a story that really stuck with me. Sorry, you were saying, Dwayne?
So I just want to know where the girl is right now, the 14-year-old.
She's at home with her mom, and she's in school back again. But I can't tell you where she lives.
Yeah. You know, I just wanted to add one thing from the work that I've been doing in our centers that we have set up in Guyana. And the thing that comes across to me about suicide is that it's often seen as a means of getting rid of unbearable pain that people cannot bear. And most people don't necessarily want to kill themselves and end their life, but they want to stop the pain. And that pain could come from domestic violence. It could come from being totally needy and not having money or food to put on the table for their children, which gets mixed up with alcoholism, where people just drink to lose their sorrows. It could be unrequited love, where someone falls in love with someone and a family member doesn't agree, so they decide, okay, let's end it.
Priya,
you know?
What do you make of the government's response? I want to play Dr. George Norton. He is the Public Health Minister. And I'm interested to see what you think of the government's response to this high suicide rate in Guyana. Have a listen to Dr. Norton.
We would like the whole country and the world at large to know that we were not just sitting back hoping that some magic will happen and suicide will disappear. No, we actually developed, and we have, along with our mental health strategy, we have a national suicide prevention plan. And this plan is what we want everybody to be fully aware of, because a lot of work was put into it, not only by our local expertise, but also by PAHO, WHO, and persons from abroad.
So there's a National Suicide Prevention Plan, 2015 to 2020, so a 5-year plan. So Priya, what do you think of that plan? Is it helpful?
It has been around for a while. During the previous administration, they started to compile it, and WHO and PAHO have done a great job in terms of helping them to inform and come up with a plan. And there's still a lot more work to be done. Mm-hmm. But here's the problem that I have, and I have expressed this to the president, and I expressed it to the Minister of Public Health the minute he took office, and that is that this is a crisis, and we would like to see things move much, much faster.
Sure.
And so, while that plan will take at his level
and
a longer time.
It involves community-based interventions, better training, retraining, some very sort of pragmatic help for communities that don't have much right now.
Exactly. So, but what is pressing is the fact that the suicide is not stopping. It's not stopping. I just to sort of put some perspective
the reason why this
to this.
I don't want to jump in at this point.
One way in which there needs to be actionable steps, right? Yeah. And we've been having conversations about decriminalizing suicide for a very long time now, and yet there has been such slow movement in terms of getting this off of the books. So if we're talking about just very actionable things that can be done, this is one way, right? If we're going to be talking about legislation, and yet the previous government. This clearly wasn't priority enough, and in the current administration as well, there's just been dragging of the feet where we haven't seen any movement. And sure, there's been talk about it in Parliament, but there hasn't been anything that's been done about decriminalizing suicide in the country. So I mean that's one way that we can take an actionable step as well.
So Savitri, here's another way I want to share this actionable step, because Savitri mentioned it. Jermaine, I'll go to you with this, but I want to bring this in from Sabrina, who brings in another actionable step. She says Guyana should focus on mental health reform that includes mental health education for students, but she also has a criticism for one of the plans in place. There's a tweet here from her. She goes on to say, I'm concerned about the hotline that's run by police officers, specifically with regards to the training that they undergo. And because we've just mentioned, as Savitri just mentioned, Jerwayne, that it is, of course, illegal to attempt or to commit suicide, then being able to call the hotline and getting a police officer on the other side might pose a problem for some people. What do you make of that?
Precisely.
Yeah, and people are generally apprehensive of making contact with the police in this country because of how the police deal with certain issues. So, for example, a friend of mine messaged me the other day on Facebook, and she said there was a sort of an altercation between her neighbor and her neighbor's husband. And the neighbor's husband apparently suffers from mental health issues. And so she's wondering if she should call the police or who exactly she should call. What I advised her, I said, yes, you can call the police because this is an issue of violence. And I mean, she showed me a video where the wife was beating up the husband, but I said what you should also do is make contact with the Ministry of Health. Do not allow the police officers to deal with the issue by themselves, because if they do that, they will treat it as a criminal issue and they will not take care of this man's mental health. The police officers came by themselves.
Even with
could
the
not be
Ministry of
contacted.
Health.
And the police basically took him to the police station.
Yes, allow Dwayne to finish his sentence. Dwayne, that's your prompt to finish your sentence quickly. Savitri, yes.
With the Ministry of Health, I have to say that currently Guyana, the way in which they go about protocols in handling folks who come forward with mental health issues, or if their family members have made a report, is through the Mental Hospital Ordinance of 1930. So I would also argue that
Savitri, what does that actually mean, Savitri? What does that mean?
The Mental Hospital Ordinance is a colonial ordinance from 1930 that is still being used by medical professionals and the government. And those are the provisions that are used when people enter the mental health system. So there are no provisions to really, protect the rights of folks who have mental health impairments that come into the system. And so presently, or in the last administration, there was a draft proposal, and this was done way back in 2010. So the previous administration, didn't pass this through through government channels, through legislative channels.
Right.
And now the current government
about the helpline. Caitlin, let me just share this with our guests, because we're right at the very end of this program. We're going to take you all online because I know there's so much more to talk about. Caitlin, you are a psychologist. How many psychologists are there in Guyana?
Currently, there's 5.
There are 5.
Wow. And we have a population of 750,000.
750,000 and 5 psychologists.
Exactly.
Yes.
Caitlin,
so
how do you do it? Hold tight, because I don't think that needs any more unpacking. But Caitlin, how do you even work in that situation?
I'm very tired.
Yeah.
No, this is the reason why implementation is taking so long. We have such limited resources, and we have to spread it throughout 10 regions. The ministry is trying. We're trying every day, but we have limited resources. So we're trying our best.
I'm not sure I can accept
that. We set up one of the ways that we've
ministry's responsibility to make sure.
So, guests, hold tight for a moment, because you're all talking at the same time. I love it, but I'm just gonna separate you a little bit. Let me just check in with Malika to see how people have been reacting to this conversation.
I will end here with this tweet from Vidyaratha, who says, this will take political will and it'll take leadership consensus, but it's clearly not a legislative priority right now. I know that is cause for debate among some people online, but he seems to think this isn't an issue.
Do you know what I'm thinking, Dwayne, is that if you have 5 psychologists for 750,000 people, mental health isn't being taken seriously. In the last sort of 30 seconds of our conversation, how would you sum up the way that mental health is being treated in Guyana?
We still shame mental health issues. I mean, there was a 2016 UNICEF situation analysis on women and children, which spoke about the not only mental health illness, but also about persons living with disabilities, where they said that the issues culturally are shamed. So how we deal with it now is the same way we've dealt with it.
Caitlin Vieira, Supriya Singh, and Savitri Persaud. We are taking you online, stream.outerzero.com. Our conversation about mental health and the high rate of suicide in Guyana continues at stream.outerzero.com. Hopefully, I'll see you there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Hello again. This is our post show for our Guyana conversation about the high rate of suicides in that country. You know when a conversation is going well is when you hear four voices all at the same time. So we're just going to pick them apart a little bit and talk about politics and the government. What is their role in this issue? Malika.
So we ended our conversation on television with this tweet. I'll bring it up again. It will take political will and some leadership consensus. It's clearly not a legislative priority. There are others who push back and say it is a priority, just not enough has been done. I want to play a video comment for you from a member of the opposition, a member of parliament. This is Frank Anthony, and this is what he told us needs to happen.
Right now, there are a couple of things that are wrong with what we are doing. A lot of the strategy is focused centrally. The staff and everybody is located centrally, whereas suicide is happening in the rural communities of Guyana. So we need to decentralize the services that we are provided.
So, Supriya, there would be some who say this is being politicized and the opposition and the ruling party are not actually taking to heart those who need the help and instead are playing political football with it. But his point, I'm wondering your thoughts on it, that there needs to be more help outside of Georgetown.
Absolutely. That what he's saying is correct. There is a lot of problems at the village level. That's where it's happening. The government is doing, as Caitlin said, as best as they can. The Guyana Foundation, for instance, whose patron is the First Lady of the country, she came to the opening of our center. What we are doing and the way we're facing this problem is we've set up sunrise centers, and we'll set up another 5 next year. And these centers offer skills training and counseling 6 days a week that is totally free and confidential to people in villages. We're now dealing with the Essequibo Coast and recently had a pilot phase where we were able to bring in at least 56 students, and we are now oversubscribed for the next courses that we have to offer. And the First Lady is working with us. She is the patron of the organization. And in fact, when we had our opening a few days ago, the president said to me, what is it that we can help you to do? Because he sees the need and he understands the failings of the government in terms of reaching everywhere. And he is saying to me, okay, as a nonprofit, this is what you're doing, but how can we help? So I think that it's not that they are not, they don't want to help or they're not doing.
I want to stop you there for a minute, Supriya.
Guess. We only have so much time, just one at a time. Dwayne and then Savage Street. Dwayne, go ahead.
The state has an obligation to set up a reasonable framework to tackle the issue of suicide. If it is that we still have the mental health ordinance from 1930, and we still treat people with mental illnesses the same way that we've treated them for the last how much years, 80 or 90 years, then how really can we even say that they're doing enough? I mean, it is the obligation of the state to put mechanisms in place. I will not accept the idea that they don't have to, they can't hold shared responsibility.
There's no one on this panel saying they're doing enough.
Actually,
there are shortcomings.
So I will say that it was.
So Dwayne, let me just bring in Savitri because she also wanted to add something to this part of the conversation. Savitri, go ahead.
I just want to include and agree with that tweet that was put out there, is to say that there is no will. There is no political or legislative will, and there hasn't been any will in the past administration, in the past governments, and there doesn't seem to be much will in this administration.
Let me just put this to you. So there is a retreat right now with members of the Ministry of Health. Dr. Karen Gordon-Boyle sent this to us specifically for this show. She says, we are de-emphasizing the institutionalizations of persons with mental illness, stressing the importance of community-based care and treatment. Even though our laws still criminalize suicide attempts, they are not enforced.
That's incorrect.
We will be advocating for the amendment of those archaic laws. So she's saying this to us. You are challenging that statement.
Those laws are enforced at the whim of police officers who encounter these cases of suicide when they have been called or an attempted suicide. And I know this from my own research and speaking to people whose family members have taken their lives by suicide. One imam whose nephew took his life by suicide told me,
allow Savitri to finish. I can hear her.
Told me that he was essentially shaken down for a bribe by police officers with no scruples, who said to him that when he intervened in the suicide of his nephew had hanged himself, and when he intervened and cut down that rope, that The police officer said, no, you should not have intervened in that situation. We are the people that have to come and address that situation. And he was essentially shaken down for a bribe. So my point is to say that we cannot just have these blanket statements that say, oh, well, we don't enforce that law, when in fact it is left at the whim of police officers because it is still on the books and it needs to be stricken from the books.
Agreed. Agreed.
I don't have a way to corroborate what you're saying, and we don't have a police representative in this conversation, but thank you for sharing that particular story, but without corroboration. Malika.
I want to bring this in because it's a point that all of our guests here raised a little bit earlier, and this is just reiterating it online. This is Karinya, who says with just 5 psychiatrists and an over-reliance on volunteers, trained, confidential mental health professionals are needed. Caitlin, another person, picks up on that and says what else is needed is more hands-on doctors going to villages, promoting help for people that are having suicidal thoughts or who are depressed. Do you see that happening anytime soon?
I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, we do that weekly. We do outreaches all over the country, all the time, every week. I've only been working here in Guyana for about a year and a half. I've been to all 10 regions, multiple villages in each region. So we have been doing it. But the problem is we don't have people to go and stay.
We do need a lot more trained professionals. In fact, I want to share with you that earlier this year I was in Havana, Cuba, and I approached the government of Cuba and I asked them, I said, because they give us scholarships every year for medical students. And I said, look, is there any way that you can train these doctors that you send back or put more of an emphasis on mental health? Because if we're going to combat this problem, we must find mental health professionals to spread out across the 10 regions of Guyana. And Guyana is a vast country, rivers that are 22 miles at its mouth. Gives you a sense of the magnitude of the country and the landscape. And so we are desperately in need. And if this program could do anything today, if this program could achieve anything, and the reason I have appeared on this program is that people are suffering. Yes, people are dying. I don't want the world to look at it as the sensationalization of people killing themselves like lemmings in Guyana. I don't want that to be the stigma for Guyana. I want to say that we've had a very troubled past. And from here on in, if the global community can assist us in any way, with training, with networking, so that we can access professional training for our people, is that, I think that would be a good accomplishment.
I'm not exactly sure how far training goes in suicide prevention, because when you look at the factors that contribute to suicide, like how does training really help with issues of poverty and joblessness, the economic situation, social situations, gender-based violence, alcohol abuse?
Dwayne, if you stop talking for a moment, then Supriya might be able to tell you.
Okay, right now I have a center that is called the Sunrise Center, located at Lot 1, Zorgan Flight, Essequibo. It's open 6 days a week and it has a counselor in it. Today, when we have that counselor sitting there paying her a salary, at 2 of them actually. And let me tell you, those professionals from June of this year to now have saved lives. So yes, if I had that Sunrise Center offering skills training alone, it would be of no use to the community. Today, we had people who came in to register for classes in January, and my counselor said to me, my mother, a woman came in, she said, look, I can't wait until January. I have 3 people, we need counseling before January. I said to her, open the doors, get the counseling staff together, counsel those people. So let me tell you something, on the ground, we need that counseling, because the pain that the people that are feeling and the pain that makes them commit this horrible act is pain that needs to be treated, and we do need professional help. We need it across the country.
And there's no doubt that we need that professional help. There's absolutely no doubt. And that's when we're talking about it at very individual levels. And I completely agree. But I think what Dwayne is also signaling to are these larger systemic issues, which we have failed to address. And it's
these structural
crucial
issues that a lot of us have not been looking at.
We could continue right now to throw blame around the country. And while we sit here doing that, you have 4 people who committed suicide, who tried to commit suicide this weekend in Essequibo. 3 of them lived. They ingested poison. 1 of them died. I just got that text, which happened over this weekend.
For me, suicide is a symptom of something much greater.
So, Dwayne and Supriya, as an outsider, I am seeing that, and I'm hearing that there are some major systemic problems and society problems as well. But there are other countries in the world that are not dissimilar to Guyana who don't have that high suicide rate. So maybe the difference is, how do people cope? How do they manage? What help do they have? There are many countries that have a brain drain and they have poverty. But those two don't necessarily equate. Poverty and a high suicide rate don't necessarily go together.
Then you have to take into consideration the cultural perspective that comes from our very history of slavery and indentureship, what the family structure looks like today, what the cultural backgrounds look like today, how people worship, how people
because otherwise, Dwayne,
lives.
are you not saying that then Guyana, for
well,
decades to come, is going to have this extraordinary...
We continue this dialogue ad nauseum, and we could continue to analyze the problem of why suicide is happening. But we know that it has reached crisis proportions. It is higher than what the World Health Organization has stated. Many cases go unreported. And so we have the problem. And the point I want to make is that we should get off the track of trying to blame each other or who's doing what to what.
Well,
and I think at this point, we need to start
I don't agree that the conversation is a blame game. I mean, conversation is always important.
Very easily down the road,
one of the things
where blame shifts
that is really necessary is for us to disaggregate the data, the suicide data that is out there. So like, what is suicide and the experiences of suicide like among youth, among women who are under the age of 35, about LGBTQIA+ persons? And I mean, even though right about now I'm sitting in the Office of the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, and they presented a document to me that they have presented to the government mapping out the experiences of LGBT people and suicide. And one of the things that they pointed out was the unavailability of the family structure and a supportive family structure for LGBT youth who are now moving into their identities and living in a very homophobic society. So the reason why I call for a disaggregation of the data and even a disaggregation of the approaches to tackle suicide is because the experiences of everybody in this country is different. And if we continue to lump everybody's experiences together and say, okay, we just need to deal with suicide in this country, well, then we won't find ourselves anywhere, because all we're doing is having conversations and telling people, hey, your situation is horrible, we know that, but that's not the way out. And I mean, when I'm a young LGBT person, I don't want to hear that motivational conversation without you giving me some sort of way that I can actually become a productive member of this society, even if I am a transgender woman, because for transgender women, the experience is even worse. So what we need to look at, the experiences of the minority groups in this country, and that includes youth, women, LGBT people.
So Guess, I know this is a long conversation and we're not going to get to the root of it in 45 minutes, even though I've got superb guests. I'm going to wrap it up for now. We're going to continue online. I know we've had a lot of online community engagement as well. Thank you so much for being part of this show. Malika, where would you like to leave us?
Well, I'll leave us with someone who's skeptical but also has hope. This is Farah. She says, I'd like to say that I have faith in the government initiatives and their hotline, but my skepticism comes from experience. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it's helping people. And she goes on to thank you all for talking about this issue.
Caitlin, Dwayne, Supriya, Savage Tree, thank you for being part of this special edition of The Stream. Really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.